Hi, this is Barry here, and you're very, very welcome to today's podcast episode from WriteCome.com. And today I thought we'd have a look at 5 ways to create an endless supply of stories to write about. Now, I don't know what you're like, but when I was beginning and, I began my writing, that was one thing that used to just stop me in my tracks because, I would be all set up and ready to go to start writing. I'd open up the laptop and I would just look at the blank screen, and like mirroring that blank screen, my mind would just go blank. And the longer I looked at that cursor flashing on and off, and I kept forcing saying, come on, you need to write a story, come on, it's not hard, you can find something. The more it just seemed to strangle my creativity, and nothing came to mind. I couldn't think of a thing. And maybe you're going through that too. Maybe you're frustrated because you're supposedly, an author or a writer, and, how can you be a writer when you can't even come up with an idea? So that's why I put this podcast episode together today, because this is something that I discovered for myself, and, I've used these techniques myself to come up with story ideas, and, I found them very, very helpful, and I hope you do too. So the first one I would recommend is having a look at the news, the TV and newspapers. Now, when it comes to the news, you're always going to find stories that are just going to, make you stop on your tracks, and, who are kind of, the weird and wacky that you would never ever think of in a million years writing. Like a number of years ago, there was that story about the man that locked himself in the ATM machine. Now, whether he still has a nickname and been slagged off about it, I don't know. But for whatever happened to him, he got locked in this ATM machine and he got trapped in it. And it came to a stage when how he got out was he was passing slips through the cash dispenser. Some customers going by outside, and they got this kind of save me message that came out through the machine instead of cash. And of course the police were called and he was rescued. But for me, I would never ever thought of a scenario like that. And they're always in the papers, kind of weird and wacky things. And if you're looking for a scene for your book, something maybe, I don't know, something to inspire your creativity, sometimes having a look at those weird stories can fire something up in you. Another thing then too when it comes to the news is, apart from the weird and the wacky, just have a look at even maybe the serious kind of stories that are going on at the moment. Like, for example, there are a couple of last year or the year before, it was, Donald Trump and South Korea, and this kind of, the way they kind of had a standoff between each other, and everybody assumed that there was going to be a nuclear Armageddon, and that, two crazy people had been given the button and we were all doomed. And of course, we're thankfully we're still all here. If you're listening to this podcast, we're still all here. But could you use maybe that storyline? Maybe if you were thinking maybe doing apocalyptic, write an apocalyptic story. Could you use this build up to the war maybe as a starting point of your book, and then take it from there? If whatever happened, if the missiles were launched, and how the world changed after that event. Even maybe have a look at, for example, again, going back to America, like a couple of years back, there was all those kind of floods in Florida and the winds and storms and everything that happened there. And some people were kind of found floating around in the water, they're found standing on rooftops, and, their homes were wrecked. Could you take something from one of those kind of news pieces? For example, maybe you could base your romance book on a character, maybe some woman maybe who's found floating in the water, and she strikes up a romance with the firefighter, the paramedic that rescued her. Could you do maybe something along the lines of maybe a mystery or a thriller where somebody is swept up, they're found floating in the water, kind of like the Bourne kind of books. He's found in the water, he's amnesia, he doesn't know who he is, what he is, how he got there. Could you base your story on a character like that, who turns up maybe who nobody in the town knows where he came from, and everybody's wondering what he was doing there, and he can't remember what he was doing there? And it could be a kind of something that, like a little bit of a prompt or something to get the ball rolling in your head. Could you write something about that? So have a look at the news stories, and the weird and the wacky, or even the serious stuff, because, and not even just the kind of national news, even in your local area, there's going to be kind of stories that would make a wonderful book, and nobody outside your local area would know about it. And maybe you could use that as a prompt for your story, and get the ball rolling, and who knows, it could, it could be really, really successful. Sometimes you don't even have to look at the big news. In the local events, there could be just something that's valuable in there too. So just don't disregard, something local that's happening, because again, even if you're writing maybe a comedy storyline, you're going to find some funny of stories that happen in your local area that, again, you would never thought of happening, and it could be what you need for starting that book of yours. Another one then too is movies and TV shows. We've all got our favourite TV shows, but maybe there's been a TV show that you watched and for some reason that episode has, stood out in your mind. So could you take maybe that TV episode and lengthen it out and make a short story or make a novel or whatever out of that? Again, what I would recommend is not following the storyline so closely with the same kind of type of characters, because everybody just knows straight away that you ripped it off. Like, for example, I created a course a while back called Cheap Children's Picture Books, and a lot of the things that authors who would create picture books, if you've never ever done it before, again, it's coming up with storylines. And what I did in that course was I recommended, for the kids niche, was to go to the kind of material that is for that age group. So for example, if you were doing a kind of younger kids picture book, maybe have a look at something like an episode of SpongeBob. What you do is you would sit down and watch the full episode, and you're going to find all these different plot points, and all these things are going to happen in this, episode of SpongeBob. But I would recommend it then was to take SpongeBob, Patrick and all the characters out, and then slot in your characters and have your characters go through the same storyline and the same kind of problems that SpongeBob or whatever was going through that in that episode. And then to make it even more unique, maybe to take that story and not have it based on the water, but take it to maybe the school playground, take it to maybe, a home environment or somewhere else, or maybe the local store or wherever it is, and make it more unique. But what you're doing is you're taking the bones of that TV show or that cartoon, and you're slotting your characters in. Again, when it comes to movies, there's nothing stopping you coming along and maybe doing a mashup between two movies. So for example, what if you mashed up Rambo and you mix it in with the sci-fi movie Starship Troopers? What if you had Rambo running around and being chased and followed by, all these different aliens, and for whatever reason, maybe he has a message he has to get back to Earth, or he has some way that he is going to save the war, or, whatever way it is, but combining those two movies together, what comes to mind? What would you see that playing out? What about maybe combining maybe Gone with the Wind and Independence Day? How maybe if you could create maybe a storyline that has maybe a wealthy alien family, and they have like a huge plantation on this alien planet, and they have slaves working for them, maybe from, they were abducted from another planet, and these are the people that do the work for them. So maybe you could do maybe what if there was maybe a revolt on the plantation or whatever. And again, just whatever your favorite movies are, what about having a look at just maybe taking two of those and combining them and kind of going from one extreme to the other, because when they're not closely related like that, when they are like a Gone with the Wind with Independence Day, like they're so far apart that it's going to be something that's never ever been done before. And again, people always say there's no such thing as every story's been covered, but it will make your work kind of more unique than maybe what other people are churning out at the moment. And it's a simple thing as just kind of combining two movies together. Again, maybe start with a scene. Maybe you've got a scene in your head that you would like to see in a movie or in a book, so why don't you just write it yourself? Now, for the longest time, I had this scene playing it in my head, and what it was that's a lot of was's but what it was, there was a pedestrian was crossing a pedestrian crossing, and he was knocked down at the crossing. This car came along and clearly knocked him down on purpose. And what I seen that scene playing in my head was that the person driving the car was somebody who had a huge gambling debt or was in trouble with the mob or something like that, and they were given this opportunity to knock down this pedestrian, because this pedestrian, as he was walking across, he was actually going to go into the courtroom and he was going to testify against the mob. So to silence this witness, what this person had to do was they had to knock them down at the pedestrian crossing, and then the case will be thrown out because there was no testimony or whatever to be given against the mob person or whatever it was being charged that day. And I, for a long time, I said to myself, God, that would be a great movie scene. I would love to see somebody playing at that. And there's going to be scenes like that where, rather than you waiting for somebody to do it and copy it, why don't you take that movie scene that's playing in your head over and over again and actually write it down. Now, whether you want to use that maybe as a start of your book, for example, that movie scene, maybe I could use that as a midpoint of the book, and I could go backwards from there, and I could say to myself, well, how did this character get into this point? How did he get so much in debt? How did he get involved with the mob? And then from that midpoint, going the other direction, coming to the end, I could say, well, what if he didn't do it? What if he chickened out at the last moment? What if, how was the repercussions? Maybe they had to have his wife as a hostage, and if he doesn't do it, like what's going to happen to the wife? And, all those different things. And again, that's just starting from that scene that I had in my head. And again, thankfully I had the wisdom to hire a good ghostwriter to write it, and it is in the Amazon Kindle store at the moment. And that was just basically just starting with a scene that, that was in my head and that I wanted to see done. And maybe you probably have kind of some kind of romance scene or kind of a comedy scene or something like that. So, why don't you, instead of letting that scene just disappear, never to see the light of day, why don't you write it and entertain somebody with it? Another thing then too that I used for coming up with a lot of ideas, I was writing in the romance genre a while back, and I found this really, really helpful, was to just do a Google image search. So for example, in the romance genre I was writing in was the mail order bride. So we're talking like in the old Wild West. So in that time, if I'd done a Google search, I would probably have found a lot of miners, men with long mustaches all standing around, probably holding their wee trays, that they're used for sifting for gold in the local stream or whatever, or maybe they're mining and they're digging underground or whatever it is. But for me, looking at those images, it fired off so many ideas in my head. Even just when looking at one character, I would say to myself, when that photograph was taken, what happened to that person to bring them to this moment in time? How did they come to be there? Why did they want to mine there? And, again, I used to think, well, okay, like maybe 10 seconds after that photograph was taken, how did their life continue on from that? What if they found gold in that river or whatever they were doing? And by doing these kind of simple Google searches, you're going to get a lot of ideas for your characters. I could look at an image and I would say, well, why has he got his moustache like that? And why is he not smiling? And, it'll give you a lot of kind of a backstory into the character just from looking at that simple image. And again, you could use that image as kind of some kind of scene in your book, and whatever way you want to do it, whether you want to work forwards, backwards, midpoint, or whatever it is. And it's basically just having a look at a simple doing a Google search and finding images that are related to whatever you're writing in. And the final one then is a life experience. What life experience did you have? Is this maybe a health experience? Maybe you had gone through something like cancer or a heart attack, or someone you loved had gone through something like that. So could you use that in your book? Could you write a story in that? Maybe you're the policeman that, that police story you want to write. Maybe the policeman has a heart attack and how his life has changed because of it, and all the different things he can't do because of it. Maybe it could be a workaholic husband, maybe who, or a workaholic, maybe businesswoman who is just, has a heart attack and it's made her rethink her life, and all the time she's been neglected, not spending time with her kids or family or whatever, and now that she has this kind of time after the heart attack, maybe she goes in this kind of this trip around the world where it opens her up to all these different opportunities, or sets her off on a kind of career path that maybe that it wouldn't have if she had continued on before that heart attack. And then even kind of, even funny situations, like maybe two people maybe were to walk around, a shopping centre, and they'd crash trolleys into each other, and all of a sudden this conversation starts between them, and then a kind of relationship, or maybe somebody who's in a fender bender and reverses into somebody else's car and they have to swap telephone numbers. You've probably had moments in that in your life where some of these things happen to you. So could you use them maybe as a building block for the characters in your book? I know even from my own life how my wife and I got together was simply that we were at a disco together, and she was walking by a friend of mine and he pinched her on the bum, and she turned around straight away and she says, okay, who did it? So from that moment we began talking, and over 20 years later we're still together and we've got 4 kids. So that moment was a really, really pivot point in my life, and maybe if he hadn't pinched her bum, maybe we wouldn't be together, and who knows what would happen. But you've probably got events in your life too that are like that. These kind of experience. So why not, throw your characters into that experience and see how they work out with it, and see what kind of, did they go down the same kind of route as you have, or you may find that maybe they go off and spiral off in a different storyline that you never even thought of before. So have a look at those 5 ideas. Your life experiences. Do a Google search. Start with a scene, whatever your favorite scene is. Combine TV shows, or take an episode of a TV show or a cartoon and, slot your characters into it and put it in a different place. And then finally in news, TV or newspapers, it doesn't have to be national, it could be local. And you're going to find, stories in there, that you could put your own spin on. For example, even when I think about the news story papers there, in some of the sites you can actually go back to some of the old, like for example, when I was writing in the mail order bride genre, you can actually go to some websites and they actually have all the newspapers from that time. So you can actually see the products that people used then. So it helps too with your research. When, if I was writing a Western book, I could mention maybe a beer that was used, or maybe a hair cream or a hair tonic or something like that too. Off the top of my mind, I can't actually think of that, and you may need to do a Google search for it. But you will find sites that have all those newspapers, and you will find, stories. For example, I was thinking of writing a romance book, and it was based on a bear attack, and I had done how the character and her father were traveling to church one morning, and this bear jumped out and he saved her life, but he'd saved her life, but he was attacked by the bear and he died. And this was the starting scene. And again, that had just simply come from finding one of those stories in the newspaper. Another one then that I actually did write a story about was it was a horrific train crash when 2 trains had crashed into each other, and this was way back in that old Western times, and I had used that as a starting point then for my mail order bride book. So have a look around. There's plenty of stories, and when you do, you'll get into a routine where you'll see stories everywhere. But I know in the very beginning it's hard, and when you're looking at that blank screen, it's the worst thing you can do. Sometimes you're better off just going for a walk, go for a drive in the car, but just make sure you have like a notepad and pen on you, and those stories will flood to you. And it's just like a muscle, that creative muscle. The more you use it, the more it will give you more and more content that you can write about. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode. I really hope that I've helped you out, and I've given you some way of getting through that blank that you're going through at the moment. If you did enjoy this episode, I'd really appreciate it if you would run over now to iTunes and leave me a quick review, because the reviews over there make a big difference to the algorithm and how many people actually find this podcast. So if you could do that, I would really appreciate it. So as always, although this episode is a bit longer than I normally do, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. And as always, take care and have a great day. Bye-bye.